Welcome to semester 2. Let's start with an overview and then we'll get specifically into 4.1 step 1. So a reminder that we've done these two pieces of the pie, the 40%, but we still have 60%, right? Paper 1 is what we're going to work on last. Paper 2 is what we're working on next. And so this is really the focus of our next 2 units. And what we have to be able to do by the time we're done is write a handwritten essay with a pen on paper in a timed scenario. And specifically, that's going to be about 2 hours in May. And you won't be able to use your books, but you'll be writing a compare-contrast essay that answers a question about the 2 books we read second semester. So let's start talking about the first book that we're going to read so that we can start getting to this end goal. Remember in semester 1, we had this overarching theme of how voice shapes truth, and we looked at how that worked in Euripides' Medea with her truths, or her voice shaping what she wanted to be the truth to manipulate others, and then O'Brien really blurring the line between fact and fiction. We've got an overarching theme in semester 2 as well, and this time it's coming of age in the margin. So coming of age meaning growing up, going from innocence to experience, becoming an adult, leaving childhood behind. In the margin, meaning not in the center, at the edges, from the perspective of those who historically have been marginalized or treated as others. All right, so the first book we're going to read is Men We Reaped by Jesmyn Ward, and then we'll be reading Colson Whitehead's Sag Harbor afterwards. Men We Reaped is nonfiction, it's a memoir. Sag Harbor is fiction. Then finally, we'll be looking at poetry as we prepare for paper 1. Paper 1 is another timed handwritten essay exam, where in this case, you'll have to analyze a poem and another text that we won't know until you actually get there at the exam. But we'll get you ready for it in Unit 6, don't you worry. Okay, so let's talk specifically about Jesmyn Ward, Men We Reaped. Our learning objective for 4.1 is students will be able to situate Men We Reaped in space and time. She looks a little bit different than our other authors, right? You probably notice right away that she's a woman. She's not a man, and she's not white. She's black. Jesmyn Ward is a voice from a historically marginalized group of writers, and I'm really excited to be able to amplify this voice in this class with you all this semester. She is also young. She's certainly still alive right now, so she is not a dead white guy. And right now, she is living and writing and working as a professor in Louisiana at Tulane University. She was born in 1977. She's younger than I am. And she is writing from a perspective that we don't hear a whole heck of a lot in the academic world. So that is partly why she is worthy of our study. The other reason is she's very acclaimed. She has not only won the National Book Award once, she has won it twice. The first woman to have ever won the National Book Award twice. Once for her novel Salvage the Bones in 2011, and again 6 years later for her novel Sing Unburied Sing in 2017. What an incredible feat to have won the award twice within 6 years. And check it out, she had only written 3 novels at that point. And she won the National Book Award twice, the most prestigious award in this country. So she is highly acclaimed. She is on every IB book list, prescribed writers list for IB, whatever they're called. Don't let anyone tell you that there aren't any writers of color on there, because there sure are, and Jesmyn Ward is one of them. We're going to read her memoir, Men We Reaped, which is not a novel, right? It is a book, but it's not fiction, so it's not a novel. We can call it a book, we can call it a memoir. We can't call it a novel. She wrote this in between these two books, 2013, and she talks about this book as being really central to herself as a writer. In fact, she says that the main event, the central event of the book, which is the death of her dear younger brother, is what really started her off writing in the first place. But it took her a couple of books before she could come back. She wrote another book before Salvage the Bones, before she could come back to this event and tell the honest truth of it, because it was so hard. The book does describe that event from under this genre of memoir nonfiction, as well as the deaths of 4 other young men who she was very close to, who grew up in the small town she came from, which is DeLisle, Mississippi. They all died violent deaths within 4 years. And you can imagine what kind of toll that would have on someone. She says that the underlying cause of their deaths was a self-destructive spiral born of hopelessness. And I have to right away give you a trigger warning that there is going to be a lot of death. We are going to watch 5 young men die, and that there is a lot of drug use and violence and things like that in the book throughout. Later on, towards the second half of the book, we will hear some racial epithets, including the N-word used against Jesmyn Ward, and then also a sexual attack. So trigger warnings right off the bat. And I try to put those in the study guide as well to help you deal emotionally with this really difficult content. But I think in the end, Ward realizes that she has to tell this story in order to get beyond the hopelessness. She has to deal with the reality and try to give a voice to these men who've been silenced through their deaths, and then get to a place where there can be change, where there is hope for something beyond this hopelessness, this trauma. Let's talk about DeLisle, the town. This is a small town, rural town in Mississippi. And not only is this where Jesmyn Ward was born and raised, it's where she still lives. And it's where her mother was born and raised, her grandmother was born and raised, her great-grandmother was born and raised. So there's a lot of history in this small town. Everybody knows each other. Everybody's grandma knows everybody else's grandma. So it's a very tight-knit community, and all the good and bad that comes with that. It's not far from New Orleans, but of course that's the big city. And she'll talk about driving to New Orleans right away in the book, and you'll hear about that. It's about a 40-minute drive. Now, Jesmyn Ward still lives in this area in DeLisle, and she still makes this drive because she is a professor at Tulane University in New Orleans. So she's still where she's writing about. And, she describes this place as being wonderful and horrible all at the same time. And you'll hear about that more with her interview. That is the next step in this lesson. The literary genre that this falls under, of course, is nonfiction. Remember, we've got the 4 from IB: poetry, prose nonfiction, prose fiction, and drama. And we want to make sure that we're understanding that this falls into the prose nonfiction category, much like First They Killed My Father from last year. Both are memoir. Now, there's other things that would fit under the prose nonfiction category. Autobiography would, political speeches, nonfiction articles, journalistic articles like in a magazine or a newspaper, those would all fit under prose nonfiction. It's a pretty big umbrella, just like prose fiction is big. This would fit your graphic novels, any kind of novel, short story. It's a large umbrella as well. And then finally we have drama. And you guys read Medea this year. Last year you read Familiar. We haven't done much of the poetry, but that is going to come last in our Unit 6 this year. What makes memoir? Well, it is a narrative written from the perspective of the author about an important part of their life. It's different than an autobiography in 3 key ways. The first is span. It doesn't span the entire life of someone. Typically, it is focused on just one part of their life, one time period, one crucial aspect. And so that time span is different. An autobiography typically follows a writer, for example, from the very beginning of their life all the way up until when they're writing it. And so a memoir has a shorter span than an autobiography. The focus is also somewhat narrow in a memoir. Now, with Ward's memoir, in certain ways, she breaks these rules because the time span of the book, you'll notice right away in the first chapter after the prologue called Wolftown that she goes all the way back to her ancestors who lived in this area. And so she does talk a lot about span, but she does stay focused, I think, on something specific in her talking about the ancestors, and it is the violent deaths that have been happening for generation after generation after generation. That generational trauma is really the key focus. But she says in her prologue that in order to tell this specific story of these 5 men who she loved, she's got to describe her entire community because community is so important in her life and in their lives. And so she goes back and tells the history, and then she focuses on herself and her own growing up. And she has 2 different kinds of chapters, some that focus on her and her growing up, and some that focus on the men and their deaths. So notice that, watch for that as you read. The last thing that's important about memoir is that sometimes the facts are loosened a little bit, not to the extent that Tim O'Brien did, and that's why we call his book fiction. But for example, you can't know exactly what someone said, and yet she's going to include dialogue in her book, or exactly what someone wore on a certain occasion, but she's going to include details like that, because that's what a good writer does. All right. Last thing is the title. You can see it is here from this quote from Harriet Tubman. She said this quote in response to the unsuccessful all-black 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment's assault on Fort Wagner in the Civil War. And so the Volunteer Infantry Regiment were fighting for the North, and they attacked, and they were the first all-black unit to see real battle, Fort Wagner, which was a Confederate fort, and it failed. A lot of men died. Harriet Tubman was there, and she said this about the event. It was recorded in a newspaper article of the time. We saw the lightning, and that was the guns, and then we heard the thunder, and that was the big guns, and then we heard the rain falling, and that was the blood falling. And when we came to get in the crops, it was dead men that we reaped. So here, of course, is the title of the book. Think about the connections between something that happened hundreds of years ago to what's happening right now as you read the book. The next step in the lesson is to listen to or read an interview with Jesmyn Ward. I hope that you enjoy that, and I hope that you enjoy the book as we get started with it too.